Hello everyone, I'm Charles Armstrong. I'm an entrepreneur, been based in London the last 12 years, and I've done a lot, I suppose, over that period to help to establish the east of London, the area around Shoreditch, as what then got branded by Downing Street as Tech City, which has become really one of the hotspots of creative and digital in England, just the same as Derry is becoming here in Ireland. So you're going to get to ask me some questions a little later on. So I'd like to start by asking you some questions. So how many of you are involved in digital and creative at this point? Is it everybody in the room? Put your hand up. Put your hand up. Okay, so it's a good majority of the people in the room. How many people in the room are already running your own business? About half of you. And then of the ones who aren't already running your own business, how many of you are thinking of setting up on your own? Okay, thank you for that. That's really helpful in giving me a sense of the proclivities of everybody in the room. So over the next half hour or so, I'm going to try to condense the last 20 years or so of my life into the key moments in my experience as an entrepreneur, my successes, my failures, the twists and turns that led me to the stage that I'm at now, standing in the room before you. So I think as the first step, if I look back at my childhood, and I grew up in Cornwall, in a rural area, what were the very first seeds that really started me on the journey? Well, I was a very active musician, initially classically trained in the keyboards, Baroque keyboards. I specialized for a while. And then I got involved in jazz. There was a really brilliant organization called the Cornwall Youth Jazz Orchestra. I think you've got one here in Northern Ireland, a youth jazz orchestra that's organized by the public sector, but that was a brilliant thing in Cornwall. And as a result of that, I formed a little jazz band, a sextet, with some of the members. And looking back, that was really my first entrepreneurial experience, because I was responsible for running it. I had to get us bookings, I had to make sure everybody turned up at the pubs or the halls where we'd been booked to play on time. I had to get everybody together to rehearse. And in retrospect, I realized that a lot of the basic management skills that have served me well over the years, that was the point I started picking them up. Because as soon as and the same thing could happen in a sports club or in any kind of activity where you're organizing people or trying to persuade somebody of something. You're learning skills that are entrepreneurially valuable. And I think that's a very important thing. You don't look at entrepreneurship as this mysterious external thing. There are already thousands of experiences that you have in your life that are contributing to your ability to set up and grow a successful business. So the next stage of that journey for me was really when I went to university. I was lucky to study at St John's College, Cambridge. I studied music initially, but then moved to social and political sciences. And I was a member of the St John's College chapel choir. And I took on the management of the Gentlemen of St John's, which was the men of the choir. And in a way, that was a fairly linear progression from what I'd been doing with jazz bands as a child. That it was a very high caliber male voice choir, but it had done very little international touring. And so I started sending off letters all around the world to the British Council and institutions like that, saying, well, you should really get us over to come and perform in your part of the world. And I had no idea what I was doing, and you're going to realize as I continue, this is a recurring theme in my story. I very often find myself just throwing myself into something that I have no idea about, and it's actually a very, very valuable thing to do. In the film that you saw earlier, there was the girl standing on the quay with the water in front of her. Like that's a very elemental experience. And the more that you can get used to standing on a precipice and just calming yourself down and then jumping off it, the more rapidly you're able to progress. So with the Gentlemen of St. John's, I was able to get tours to Italy and to Dublin. We got quite a lot of music festival bookings. And again, I learned a lot about the nuts and bolts of running a business, the bookkeeping, the promotional aspects, and more about the management. So by the time I finished university, without realizing it, I'd learned a reasonable amount about how you organize things, how you communicate them. And so I was kind of ready to set up something. And as soon as I left university, I moved down to London and I set up my first company. I put it in inverted commas because it had a very peculiar legal structure. And I'm not sure it really was a company at all. And I started off with theatre, live arts, and launched the electric company at the Edinburgh Festival. And over the next few years, this was just an incredible adventure. And there was a group of about 20 people, one way or another, who were involved in the electric company. And just a massive amount of energy. A lot of people who had ideas that they wanted to develop, things that they just weren't sure where it was leading, but they wanted to try something. And so we did, I think, 21 theatre productions over a course of 4 years. We had an installation running at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London. And it was a classic startup experience in a way, in that everybody had their fingers in everything. That if I look at our launch project at the Edinburgh Festival in 1993, I think we had 7 plays running. It was like absolutely ludicrous, the idea that this kind of completely new outfit would go and do that. But I was producing everything. I'd done the graphic design for the programs and the posters. I'd written the musical score for 2 of the productions. I was acting in one of the productions. It's a terrible idea. Like, nobody should do that. But if you're starting off, then that's the reality of what you do. And that's how you learn so much as well. There's something very exciting about startups and small businesses, that everybody gets involved in everything, because there are never enough people to have a sensible division of labor. So you learn what you're good at, you learn what you're not so good at, and you learn what the best mix of responsibilities in a team is. That project at the Edinburgh Festival was also important because it was the first time that I'd ever raised money to do something. And we needed resources to pay for the set design and stuff. And I went round banks, because I just had no idea where else you'd go for money. Banks, that's where the money is. So I went round knocking on the doors of banks, just speaking to the manager, outlining this completely crazy thing that I wanted to do in Edinburgh, saying, we need this much money. And I got a succession of completely baffled expressions, not surprisingly. And then I came to a bank where the experience was different. And the manager looked at me and he heard me out. And then he was a bit expressionless for a few seconds. And there was this silence. I thought, oh, okay, here we go again. And then he said, okay, I'm going to give you the money. I believe in this. And I was speechless. It was so unexpected that anybody would actually take that leap of faith. But it made such a difference to me. And I repaid that loan with the interest. But there have been certain points when somebody's taken a leap of faith and believed in what I was trying to do that's helped enormously. And you'll find that as well. Like if you're trying to do something new, you'll knock on lots of doors where somebody's not going to understand, or they're not going to think that you can do what you're setting out to do. But you need to be persistent. You need to keep knocking on the doors, because you will find the one where somebody can help you, they believe in you, they've got something that they can contribute to what you want to do. So through the electric company, in 1994, I met David Owen, Lord Owen, who at that point was the European Union's peace envoy in Yugoslavia. And he was in the process of writing a book about the peace process as the Yugoslav state was breaking up into civil war. And I had this idea that you could wrap around the book a kind of interactive experience with a lot of electronic information, video, peace plans, maps, interviews. And I hadn't really seen anyone do that. And back in the 90s, the CD-ROM it's what the internet's become now. You just had to have it on little silver discs instead of plugging into a telephone line. And so I went to David Owen and I said, right, you know what we should do? We should do the CD-ROM alongside the book. It'll be really, really good. And I managed to persuade him that this was a good idea. And once again, I hadn't got the faintest idea what I was doing. I'd never done a CD-ROM. I'd never done a computer-based project. But it was too late. I was committed to it by this stage. And so that, again, was a really seminal project that it turned out that most people thought what we were trying to do was impossible, that we wanted to release a CD-ROM in 4 months. We went to publishers like Penguin. They said, no, that's a 2-year project. I said, oh, we're going to have this much information in it. They said, no, you're only going to be able to fit half that amount of information. And so I progressively realized that the conventional way of doing that project wasn't going to work. But I then found people who could figure out how to actually realize what we'd set out to do. It was pretty intense. As I recall, in order to get the masters of the disc out for pressing, we actually had 6 people, including myself, working non-stop for 4 days in the basement of David Owen's office overlooking St. James's Park. And we were almost dead at the end of that. But we did it. We completed the project. It was launched at the Queen Elizabeth Conference Centre. The Economist reviewed it as a publishing landmark. All of the publishers that we'd spoken to who said it was impossible had to eat their words. And it was a great triumph. But it then led me to think, right, well, CD-ROMs, that's clearly the thing to do. And I set out to form a spin-off company from the electric company that was just going to do CD-ROMs. And we spent several months writing a business plan. And really, this was the first point that I tried to start to learn something about how you're meant to do a startup. So we wrote the business plan, we did all the financial modeling, and we went out to try and speak to investors. And it was a complete and utter disaster. And within 6 months, the band had broken up. And it was this huge suffering for me. I think for any entrepreneur, you speak to any entrepreneur, they will have failed multiple times at things. And they won't be able to disguise how much it hurts to fail. And it's not something you get used to. You care so much about everything that you set out to achieve. The things that work, you celebrate them, but it's almost like, yes, I knew that would work. Then you pass on to the next thing. The things that fail, it's like this mortal blow that is just the most terrible thing. And so that was an awful experience that I really thought that the success with creating the Balkan Odyssey CD-ROM was going to open the door to having this business that was doing all kinds of interesting CD-ROMs. In retrospect, the assumptions that were in the business plan were ludicrously unrealistic. It wasn't clear what the business was. There were already some very large and well-funded CD-ROM publishers. Why were we going to be successful against them? And so I'm not surprised we weren't able to raise investment. We just weren't ready to do that. But out of that failure, I ended up going off in a completely new and different direction. And this, again, is something that I've learned is quite typical on an entrepreneurial journey. You fail at something. Sometimes you learn something from that you pick up and go off in a similar direction. Sometimes it sends you off in a completely different direction. I met this gentleman, Michael Young, Lord Young of Dartington, who had written the Labour Party manifesto in 1945. He set up the Open University and the Consumers Association. And I got very involved in the social entrepreneurship movement and set up Circus Foundation, which became the incubator for everything I've done subsequently. That led me to do several very, very lateral things. I went to live in the Isles of Scilly for a year, which wouldn't seem relevant to any entrepreneurial journey, but actually what I learned there enabled me to set up the two businesses that I've done subsequently that have been quite successful. I also went to Ghana, spent a couple of months setting up an experimental education system there. And these were very, very different experiences than I'd had previously, but they sowed the seeds for everything that came subsequently. So 2003, I came back to London, and with the idea to set up a software business. And it was based around this idea that if you analyzed the flows of communication in an organization, you could actually start to identify what was working and what wasn't working. So it was like an alternative to having a management consultant come in and tell you what was happening. And really, everything that underlay that idea came from being in the Isles of Scilly and just seeing how a small community works and how information gets shared. So it was like one of the lessons is you find inspiration sometimes in very unexpected places. So in this case, I went out to raise money and was successful. We raised £100,000 from seed investors. I started building a prototype. We then did a very improbable deal with the Raytheon Corporation, which is a US-based defense contractor. They don't buy stuff from small British businesses very often. And I think that was an indicator that we were onto something, that we had a technology that was very, very different than what anybody else was offering. On the back of that contract, I was able to raise $6 million from an American hedge fund to grow the team. We then won a contract from McKinsey & Co., the global management consultancy. And it looked as though this time the business was really set for success. And then in October 2008, the global markets collapsed. And within a matter of weeks, our investor pulled out of the early stage tech market. All of the customers that we were in the sales process with shut down their speculative spending. And I was left with a business that had £100,000 in staff, mainly staffing costs each month, and no revenue. And for those of you who are running businesses in 2008, you'll be aware that wasn't a very good situation to be in. So once again, I was looking at a rather messy failure in the face. But this time, instead of going off in a completely different direction, my co-founder and I, we dug our heels in, that we knew that there was something important in what we were doing, and we weren't going to give up. So none of the conventional ways of continuing that business would work. We couldn't go out and find another investor, because nobody was investing at that time. So this, to come to Connell's point, we thought, right, we're going to use this completely new technique of crowdfunding. And we became the first tech business in the world to raise finance through equity crowdfunding. And are you all familiar with crowdfunding? So Kickstarter didn't exist at that time. There were a couple of music industry platforms that you could finance an album, but nobody had done it for equity before. So there were all kinds of legal difficulties. We spent a month with our lawyers, figured it out, got quite a lot of coverage from the Financial Times and others, and were able to raise that. At the same time, we were stuck with an expensive office space. That gave me the idea of creating a co-working space, because there were none in Shoreditch at that time. Also, we figured out a complete change in the product direction for the business that would enable us to continue. So there's the FT article on the crowdfunding project. And the change in direction was about, instead of analyzing data for businesses, we were going to do it for tech clusters. Because just about this time, the UK government had got interested in East London and the digital sector that was growing there. And so in 2011, the Prime Minister, David Cameron, came to launch the Tech City Map. And that led, over the following years, to a project with the University of Cambridge to launch the Cambridge Cluster Map. Last autumn, we launched the Scale Up Britain map, which is tracking scale-ups across England, Scotland, and Wales. The data's not available for Northern Ireland, which is a message to the government here. Like, we'd really love to have the analysis for Northern Ireland too. And just a couple of weeks ago, we launched the EU Startups Hub map in Berlin that's starting to analyze the whole European ecosystem. So that's an example of where failure can actually twist into becoming the seed of new ideas and developments. And just finally, I'm going to talk a bit about the trampery. So the trampery, the starting point was actually that I had an expensive office, I needed to find a way to pay the rent. But at the same time, I could see that tech and creative startups needed a different kind of working environment. The usual kind of offices weren't really appropriate. And so I came up with this formula of offering flexible terms. You don't need to commit for more than a month. You can change the number of desks you want, plus very high-grade interior design, very carefully selected members, and really lots of ways to introduce people and build strong communities. And it took off immediately. So this was the first trampery we did in 2009. 2011, the Prime Minister came to visit the second one we did that raised the level of the interior to an even higher level. 2013, we opened 2 more in London, one focused on architecture and design, the second, the UK's first accelerator for high-growth fashion labels. 2014, we opened another 2, one with the Barbican Centre for Digital Media and Arts, the second, our flagship in Old Street, where we were very glad to host Brenda a couple of months ago. And we've just launched the UK's first incubator for travel and tourism technology. So for a failure, it worked out reasonably well. Those are the sites we have at the moment, and that business is now opening up across a variety of different areas. I think I'm running pretty tight on time, but are we going to have some time for some questions?
Magically. I can ask you some questions. You're done?
Yes.
Okay.
So let me just scoot.
It's so obvious. You started off with, you were singing, you went into the arts, and then you end up in property. It's that circuitous route that I think the people, particularly the younger people at the back, need to understand that there is no course called enterprise or entrepreneur.
That's absolutely right. So be ready for the direction to be completely different than what you expect. And the more that you can be open to the twists and turns and the opportunities, the more likely you are to succeed. So start off with something that you really care about and follow that, but then keep your eyes open about where the opportunities are, and as your interests develop, follow them.
When you say your interest, but of course it could be anything, because you were not interested particularly in property back then.
No, absolutely. So as a teenager, I was interested in architecture, and it's the only profession that I ever came close to throwing myself into, but I never had any inkling of becoming a property developer. And
in terms of crowdfunding, were you terribly well connected that you managed to get that? Because I see much smaller companies trying to raise 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 euro or pounds and struggling. I know it's part of it will be the whatever you're trying to raise the funds for, but it does help when you have real believers who have deep pockets.
Yes, so I'd say the reason that crowdfunding project succeeded, there were 2 parts. First of all, I was able to get some good press coverage. The Financial Times wrote about it, the Telegraph wrote about it, TechCrunch wrote about it, but on the other side, I worked my network very, very hard, and that was most of the work. So I went to everybody I knew who could potentially contribute. Most of them didn't, but I got each of them to introduce me to 3 people, and then each of those people I got to introduce me to 3 more people. So I spoke to hundreds of people in order to find the 30 people who actually were able to make the investment.
And nowadays, using other platforms like LinkedIn and all, it's much easier again because you can actually find some of these people.
Absolutely, and there, indeed, the fact that there are crowdfunding platforms, and indeed equity crowdfunding platforms like Seedrs, that are attracting the communities of people, they make it a lot easier. It's always hard being a pioneer. It's exciting, but it's hard work.
And it's well worth going on to any of those crowdfunding sites like Kickstarter, the other large one. Indiegogo. And they all have different models of business. Some of them won't let you to raise equity. You have to give something, like if you're going to make a new bicycle saddle, you have to give a bicycle saddle away. But they will, and you can find funding for some of the most weird and wonderful. Speaking of, I always like asking my entrepreneurs to give a good idea that you say, good God, I wonder why somebody has never done that one. Within the creative industries, again, aimed at the people in the audience, have you, as you flew in here or whatever, did you say, there's an idea, I must look into that?
Well, so one idea that is in that category of why hasn't anyone done it yet? Flat sharing is becoming more and more prevalent. Nobody has done a web platform that will engage with the utility suppliers and provide an easy way to divide it amongst you. It's a really obvious idea. It's not particularly creative industries, but last week I was thinking, surely that's an obvious opportunity.
Well, it isn't creative because, of course, it's in the app industry, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Hang on a second while I write this down. Charles, thank you very much. Charles and I and all will be outside for coffee just after. We're going to have a little brief interlude with Cognition. If you can take a seat now.
Okay, thank you very much, Colin.
Thank you very much, Charles.
Thank you.